The thermometer read -47 degrees Fahrenheit when 17-year-old Marcus Chen watched the last rescue helicopter disappear into the white void above Mount McKinley. 23 stranded hikers huddled in the ranger station, their emergency supplies already dwindling after just 2 days. The radio crackled with devastating news. The storm system would last another 2 weeks, and no one was coming. Marcus pressed his face against the frost-covered window, his breath creating another layer of ice on the glass. Inside, voices rose in panic as Ranger Patterson tried to maintain order among the group. The hiking expedition had started as a routine winter trek for experienced adventurers, but the unprecedented storm had transformed it into a death trap. "We need to cut the heat rations in half," Patterson announced, his weathered face grim. "The generator fuel won't last beyond 5 days at this rate." "Are you insane?" Dr. Sarah Martinez, the expedition's medic, stood up from where she'd been treating a woman with early frostbite. "Janet's core temperature's already dropped 2 degrees. Half these people won't survive one night without proper heating." Marcus turned from the window, studying the faces around him. He recognized the signs his grandfather had taught him to watch for. The pale skin, the slight tremor in hands that weren't quite steady, the way people huddled closer together without realizing it. Hypothermia was already stalking them like a patient predator. "Maybe we should try to hike out," suggested Tom Bradley, a software engineer from Seattle whose expensive gear couldn't mask his inexperience. "The storm might be lighter in the valley." Patterson shook his head. "In this whiteout, you wouldn't make it 50 yards. The wind chill alone would kill you in minutes." Marcus slipped toward the back of the room, his mind racing through possibilities. 3 years living with his grandfather in these mountains had taught him things these people couldn't imagine. While they debated rationing and rescue scenarios, he was calculating thermal dynamics and underground insulation properties. His grandfather's voice echoed in his memory. "The earth is your friend, Marcus. 4 feet down, the temperature stays constant year-round. 55 degrees, even when hell freezes over up top." The old man had been paranoid, brilliant, and secretive in equal measure. After Marcus's parents died in a car crash, his grandfather had appeared like a ghost to claim custody, whisking him away to an off-grid existence that had seemed like an adventure at first. The reality had been harsh lessons in survival, endless drills in ancient techniques, and cryptic warnings about people who might come looking. Marcus had never understood why they lived like fugitives until the day he found his grandfather's real identification papers hidden in a coffee can. The name wasn't William Chen. It was Dr. William Zhang, former researcher at a classified government facility. The newspaper clippings told a story of missing experimental data and a scientist who'd vanished with military secrets. 2 months later, his grandfather had disappeared during a supply run, leaving only a note, "If they find me, they'll come for you. Stay hidden, stay smart, use what I taught you." Now, watching these people slowly freeze to death, Marcus felt the weight of his knowledge pressing against his ribs like a physical force. He could save them. The thermal shelter design his grandfather had perfected could house all 23 people in relative comfort, using nothing but body heat and Earth's natural insulation. Revealing that knowledge meant questions he couldn't answer. It meant explaining skills no normal teenager should possess. It meant risking exposure of the secret that had kept him alive for 3 years. "Body count," Dr. Martinez called out grimly. "I need everyone to buddy up for temperature monitoring. We're going to check core temps every hour." Marcus watched as people paired off, their movements sluggish despite their fear. Janet, the woman with frostbite, had stopped shivering, never a good sign. 2 elderly men sat unnaturally still, their faces waxy. Even the younger hikers were showing signs of cold stress. The choice crystallized in his mind with brutal clarity. Stay hidden and watch them die, or reveal himself and risk everything his grandfather had died to protect. He thought about the underground chamber his grandfather had built 5 miles northeast, concealed beneath a natural rock outcropping. The entrance was camouflaged, but Marcus could find it even in a blizzard. The chamber itself was a masterpiece of thermal engineering, 12 feet deep, lined with stones that absorbed and radiated heat, with a ventilation system that prevented carbon dioxide buildup while maintaining warmth. His grandfather had built it as their ultimate fallback position. "If everything goes wrong," he'd said, "this place will keep us alive until spring." Outside, the wind howled like something alive and hungry. Inside, someone started crying softly, a broken sound that cut through Marcus's defenses like a blade. He made his decision. The wind had teeth, and it was hungry. Sarah Chen pulled her parka hood tighter as she fought her way through the knee-deep snow toward the trading post, each step a battle against the storm that had been raging for 3 days now. The Weather Service had called it a significant weather event, but those bureaucratic words hardly captured the reality of what was happening to Whitefall. The small community of 43 souls was effectively cut off from the world. The airstrip was buried under 6 feet of snow, with more falling every hour. The supply truck that came twice a month was stranded somewhere on the highway, if it had even attempted the journey. Cell towers were down, and the satellite phone at the trading post had been crackling with static for the past day before going silent entirely. Sarah's medical training told her to stay calm, assess the situation, make rational decisions. But the growing knot in her stomach suggested that rationality might not be enough this time. The trading post bell chimed weakly as she pushed through the door, ice crystals falling from her clothes onto the worn wooden floor. Frank Morrison looked up from behind the counter, his weathered face creased with worry lines that seemed deeper than usual. "Any word from outside?" she asked, though she already knew the answer from his expression. Frank shook his head. "Nothing. Dave tried the ham radio again this morning, but he's getting interference from the storm. This isn't just bad weather, Doc. This is something else entirely." Sarah had been thinking the same thing. In her 5 years in Whitefall, she'd weathered plenty of storms, but nothing like this. The temperature had dropped to -35, and the wind was sustaining speeds that made venturing outside dangerous, even for short distances. "What about supplies?" she asked. Frank gestured toward the shelves behind him. Even from across the room, Sarah could see the gaps. "We've got maybe 2 weeks of food if everyone rations carefully. Fuel oil's the bigger problem. Most folks are burning through their winter stores trying to keep warm in this cold. I'd say we've got a week, maybe less, before people start getting desperate." The bell chimed again, and Tom Bradley stumbled in, his face red with cold and exertion. "Sarah, thank God you're here. It's Mrs. Kowalski. She's having trouble breathing and her cabin's like an icebox. Her heating oil ran out yesterday." Sarah was already moving toward the door. "Frank, can you spare any fuel?" "I'll see what I can do," Frank said, but his tone suggested the well was running dry there, too. The trek to the Kowalski cabin was treacherous. Sarah found herself following Tom's footsteps exactly, afraid to deviate from the path he'd carved through the snow. The wind was so loud she could barely hear her own thoughts, and the blowing snow limited visibility to just a few feet. Mrs. Kowalski was in bad shape. The 83-year-old woman was bundled under every blanket she owned, but her lips had a bluish tint that Sarah didn't like. Her breathing was shallow and labored. "We need to get her somewhere warm," Sarah told Tom. "Help me get her to the community center. At least they still have heat." As they carefully moved Mrs. Kowalski, Sarah's mind was already racing ahead to the bigger picture. If the storm didn't break soon, they'd have more than one elderly resident in crisis. The community center's oil supply wouldn't last forever either, especially if they started housing multiple families there. That's when she saw him. Through the blowing snow, a figure emerged from the tree line behind the Kowalski place. At first, Sarah thought it might be another community member coming to help, but something about the way he moved was different. He wasn't fighting the storm like everyone else. He seemed to glide through it, as if he understood something about the weather that the rest of them didn't. The young man approached them with confident steps, and Sarah got her first clear look at him as he drew near. He couldn't have been more than 25, with dark hair and intense eyes that seemed to take in everything at once. His winter gear was well made but not expensive, and notably, he didn't seem as affected by the brutal cold as everyone else. "She needs warmth," he said without introduction, his voice carrying clearly despite the wind. "I can help." Tom looked skeptical. "Who are you? I don't recognize you." "Name's Marcus," the stranger replied. "I've been staying in the area. Look, we can talk later, but right now she needs to get warm fast, and the community center isn't going to be warm enough for much longer." Sarah felt a chill that had nothing to do with the weather. "What do you mean?" Marcus looked directly at her, and she saw something in his eyes that was both reassuring and unsettling. "I mean, I know how to keep people alive in weather like this. The question is whether you trust me enough to let me help." The wind howled like a living thing, rattling the windows of the Clearwater Lodge with such violence that Sarah Chen feared the glass might shatter. She pressed her face against the frost-covered pane, trying to make sense of the white chaos beyond. The world had vanished. Trees, mountains, even the outline of the generator shed 20 feet away had been swallowed by the storm. "It's been 18 hours, she said, turning to face the dozen other stranded souls huddled around the dying fire in the main room. "This isn't letting up." Tom Briggs, the lodge owner, poked at the embers with a metal rod. His weathered face looked older in the firelight, deep lines etched by worry. "Radio's dead, landlines down. Even if the storm passes, the roads will be impassable for weeks." Sarah felt her stomach clench. She'd come to Alaska for a story about wilderness tourism, not to become part of a survival narrative herself. Around the room, she could see the same realization dawning on the other faces: 3 hunters from Montana, a honeymooning couple from Seattle, 2 researchers from the university, and an elderly man named Harold who'd been visiting his late wife's favorite place. "How much food do we have?" asked Dr. Martinez, one of the researchers. Tom's silence stretched too long. "With rationing? Maybe 4 days." In the corner, barely visible in the shadows, the young man they'd pulled from the storm sat quietly. Kai, that's all he'd given them for a name. His clothes had been strange, well-made but unfamiliar, and he'd carried nothing but a peculiar knife and a small leather pouch. Most unsettling were his eyes, which seemed to take in everything while revealing nothing. "What about the generator?" Sarah asked. "Fuel's running low," Tom admitted. "I wasn't expecting to host this many people this long." The honeymoon couple, David and Lisa, exchanged worried glances. Lisa had been fighting a cold, and in this temperature it could easily turn into something worse. "There might be another option," Kai said quietly from his corner. All eyes turned to him. In the 18 hours since they'd brought him inside, he'd spoken perhaps 20 words total. "What kind of option?" Tom asked, his voice carrying the edge of a man with few choices left. Kai stood slowly, moving to the window. He studied the storm with an intensity that made Sarah uncomfortable, as if he could read patterns in the chaos that escaped everyone else. "Underground shelter," he said. "Protected from wind, better insulated, room for everyone. You know of one nearby?" Dr. Martinez leaned forward. "I can build one." The room fell silent, except for the storm's relentless assault. Sarah found herself studying Kai's profile, noting the calm confidence in his posture. He wasn't boasting or trying to impress anyone. He was simply stating a fact. "In this storm?" Harold's voice cracked with disbelief. "Son, you'll die before you take 10 steps out there." Kai turned from the window. "Not in the storm. Under it." Tom stood up, his expression skeptical. "Look, kid, I appreciate the offer, but digging in frozen ground with a blizzard overhead isn't exactly—" "The ground isn't frozen 6 feet down," Kai interrupted. "And there's a natural depression behind the lodge. Geological formation that would provide structural support." Sarah blinked. "How could he possibly know that?" "You're talking about major excavation," said one of the hunters, Mike. "Even with proper equipment, which we don't have." "Don't need equipment." Kai moved to his small pack and withdrew the knife Sarah had noticed earlier. In the firelight, she could see it more clearly. The blade was unlike anything she'd ever seen, with strange dark metal and intricate markings along the edge. "A knife isn't going to dig through," Mike began. It's not just a knife. Kai's voice carried a weight that made everyone pause. And I'm not just a hiker. The admission hung in the air like smoke. Sarah felt her journalist instincts prickle. There was a story here, buried beneath Kai's careful words and guarded expressions. What exactly are you? She asked. For a moment, something flickered across Kai's features. Uncertainty, perhaps even fear. But it passed quickly, replaced by that same unsettling calm. Someone who knows how to keep people alive in impossible situations. Tom studied the young man for a long moment. Outside, the wind shrieked even louder, and somewhere in the lodge's structure something creaked ominously. How long would this shelter take to build? 8 hours, maybe less. And you're sure it would hold everyone? Kai nodded. It would be better than this. Warmer, more secure. Tom looked around the room, meeting each person's eyes. Sarah could see him weighing their dwindling options against the mysterious stranger's unlikely promise. All right, Tom said finally, but if we're trusting you with our lives, I think we deserve to know who you really are. Kai's hand tightened almost imperceptibly on his knife handle. Some knowledge, he said quietly, comes with a price you might not want to pay. The wind screamed across the frozen landscape with a fury that seemed almost personal, as if nature itself had declared war on anything foolish enough to exist in this desolate corner of Alaska. Through the small, reinforced window of the ranger station, Elena Vasquez watched the world disappear into a wall of white that moved like a living thing, consuming everything in its path. Visibility's down to maybe 10 feet, she called over her shoulder to Marcus Chen, who hunched over the radio equipment with the desperate intensity of a man trying to resurrect the dead. Static filled the room, punctuated by his increasingly frustrated attempts to raise anyone. The Park Service, emergency services, even other ranger stations hundreds of miles away. Nothing, Marcus muttered, adjusting dials that refused to cooperate. It's like the whole world just went dark. Elena pulled her coat tighter and turned from the window. The ranger station, built to withstand harsh weather, groaned under the assault of the storm. Every few seconds, the building shuddered as another gust hit with the force of a freight train. She'd weathered plenty of storms in her 15 years as a park ranger, but nothing like this. The Weather Service mentioned something about this being a once-in-a-century event, she said, more to fill the oppressive silence than because Marcus needed the reminder. But they also said it would pass north of us. Yeah, well, Mother Nature apparently can't read a forecast. Marcus slammed his fist against the radio console, then immediately looked apologetic. Sorry, it's just... My daughter's supposed to call tonight. It's her birthday. Elena nodded, understanding. They all had people on the outside, lives that existed beyond this wilderness that now felt more isolated than the surface of Mars. She thought of her own family in Anchorage, probably watching news reports and wondering if she was safe. The irony wasn't lost on her. She'd chosen this remote posting partly to escape the complications of civilization, and now civilization was exactly what she craved. The door burst open with a crash that made both rangers jump. Snow and wind roared into the station like an invasion force, followed by a figure so bundled in winter gear that Elena initially couldn't tell if it was human. The person, definitely male, she realized as he fought to close the door, was covered head to toe in snow and ice, his movements urgent but controlled. Jesus Christ, Marcus said, jumping up to help secure the door. What are you doing out there? Are you insane? The stranger pulled back his hood, revealing a young face marked by intense brown eyes and weathered features that seemed older than his apparent 20-something years. Elena noticed his hands first, scarred and calloused in a way that spoke of serious outdoor experience, not the soft hands of a weekend hiker who'd gotten in over his head. My name is Kai, he said, his voice steady despite the fact that he'd just walked through what amounted to a horizontal hurricane. I've been tracking this storm for 3 days. You need to evacuate this building. Elena and Marcus exchanged glances. Evacuate to where? Elena asked. In case you haven't noticed, we're in the middle of nowhere, and there's a blizzard outside that could strip flesh from bone. Kai began unwrapping layers of outerwear with practiced efficiency, the storms intensifying faster than the models predicted. This building won't hold. The foundation's already compromised. You can feel it in how the structure moves. You've got maybe 6 hours before the roof goes. And you know this how? Marcus challenged, though Elena noticed he was unconsciously listening to the building's groans with new attention. Because I've seen what storms like this can do. Kai's tone carried a weight that suggested experience with disasters beyond his apparent years. I have a shelter, underground. It's designed for exactly this kind of situation. I can get you there safely, but we need to move soon. Elena studied the young man more carefully. Everything about him suggested competence, the way he'd entered the building, how quickly he'd assessed their situation, the calm certainty in his voice. But there was something else, something in the way his eyes moved constantly, as if scanning for threats that existed beyond the storm. You just happen to be wandering around out there in this weather? She pressed. I live out here, Kai said simply, and right now, that's your good fortune. Another massive gust hit the building, and this time Elena heard something new in the structure's response, a subtle shift, a settling that confirmed what Kai had said about the foundation. The ranger station that had been her sanctuary for 3 years suddenly felt fragile as paper. How far to this shelter of yours? She asked. 1/4 mile. I've already marked the route. Marcus looked up from the radio he'd been futilely working. This is insane. We don't know anything about this guy. Elena met Kai's steady gaze and made a decision that would change everything. Get whatever emergency supplies we can carry, she told Marcus. We're leaving. The temperature gauge on Marcus Chen's radio equipment read -42 degrees Fahrenheit when the first body was discovered. Sarah Martinez had volunteered for the morning patrol, checking the perimeter markers Kai had insisted they establish around the underground shelter. The wind had finally died to a whisper, leaving behind an alien landscape of sculpted snow drifts that rose like frozen waves against the pale dawn sky. She'd been following the rope line Kai had strung between the shelter entrance and the emergency supply cache when she saw the dark shape protruding from a snowbank 50 yards off the designated path. Marcus! She called through the handheld radio, her voice crackling with static and something else. You need to get out here. Bring Kai. The body belonged to Jim Forrester, the bush pilot whose Cessna had gone down 3 days before the blizzard hit. Sarah had heard the stories around the fire, how search and rescue had been looking for him when the storm struck, forcing them to abandon the mission. Now she understood why they'd never found him. Kai emerged from the shelter entrance with the fluid silence that had become his trademark, Marcus stumbling behind him in the deep snow. The young man's eyes swept the scene with the methodical precision of someone accustomed to reading death in the wilderness. He knelt beside the frozen corpse, his bare hands moving over the snow around the body with surprising gentleness. He's been here since before the storm, Kai said, his voice carrying no emotion. Tried to dig a snow cave. See the scattered snow here? He started the excavation but didn't finish. Marcus pulled his parka hood tighter against the cold. Poor bastard probably got disoriented. Hypothermia does that. Makes you think you're warm when you're dying. Kai's response was sharp enough to make both Marcus and Sarah look at him more closely. He knew what he was doing. This is textbook emergency shelter construction. Someone with training started this. Sarah watched as Kai continued his examination, noting how his hands moved with the confidence of experience that seemed impossible for someone his age. There was something clinical about his assessment, as if he'd seen this before, multiple times. What stopped him then? Marcus asked. Kai was quiet for a long moment, his fingers tracing patterns in the snow that meant nothing to the others but seemed to tell him a story. When he finally spoke, his words carried a weight that settled uneasily in Sarah's stomach. He was interrupted. The implications hung in the frigid air between them. Sarah felt her pulse quicken as she scanned the endless white expanse surrounding them. The isolation that had felt protective suddenly seemed threatening, full of invisible dangers lurking beyond their sight. Interrupted by what? she whispered. Kai stood slowly, his eyes fixed on something in the distance that the others couldn't see. There are tracks leading away from here, old ones, mostly filled by the storm but still visible if you know how to look. Marcus stepped closer to where Kai was pointing, squinting at what appeared to be unmarked snow. I don't see anything. They're there. Kai's certainty was unshakable. Boot prints, size 11 or 12, heading northwest toward the tree line. Sarah felt a chill that had nothing to do with the temperature. You're saying someone else was out here during the storm? Someone who left Jim to die? I'm saying someone was out here who didn't want to be found, Kai replied. Someone who knew this area well enough to survive what killed him. The three of them stood in silence, processing the implications. Their shelter, their sanctuary, suddenly felt vulnerable. If someone else was surviving in this wilderness, why hadn't they sought help? Why hadn't they assisted the dying pilot? We should get back, Marcus said finally. Tell the others. No. Kai's response was immediate and firm. We don't tell anyone about this. Not yet. Sarah stared at him. What do you mean we don't tell anyone? There might be someone else out there who needs help. Or someone dangerous. Either way, the group has a right to know. Kai met her gaze with those unsettling pale eyes. Panic will get people killed faster than the cold. We need more information before we make any decisions. This isn't your call to make, Marcus protested. We're not your responsibility. Something flickered across Kai's face then, a shadow of memory or pain that was gone before Sarah could interpret it. When he spoke again, his voice carried an authority that seemed to come from someplace deeper than his apparent years. Yes, he said quietly. You are. The finality in his tone ended the discussion, but it raised questions that gnawed at Sarah as they made their way back to the shelter. Questions about who Kai really was and what kind of past had taught someone so young to read death scenes with such professional detachment. Behind them, Jim Forrester's body disappeared beneath the blowing snow, taking his secrets with him into the frozen ground. The morning brought an eerie silence that made Sarah's skin crawl. The howling wind that had battered their shelter for 3 days had finally died, leaving behind a stillness so complete it felt unnatural. Through the narrow ventilation shaft, pale light filtered down, casting strange shadows across the underground chamber where 14 people had somehow survived the worst blizzard in recorded Alaskan history. Marcus was already awake, crouched near the main tunnel entrance with his ear pressed against the makeshift door he'd constructed from salvaged metal and debris. His dark hair hung in greasy strands around his face, and Sarah noticed the way his hands trembled slightly as he worked to clear the snow that had accumulated against the barrier. How bad is it out there? Dr. Chen asked, her voice hoarse from the dry air. She'd been treating old Pete Morrison's frostbite with their dwindling medical supplies, but the infection was spreading despite her efforts. Marcus didn't answer immediately. He continued his methodical work, using tools that none of them recognized, implements he'd somehow fashioned from scrap metal with a precision that spoke of extensive experience. When he finally looked back at the group, his expression was grim. We're buried under at least 8 feet of snow. The main entrance is completely blocked. He paused, studying their faces in the dim light of the improvised oil lamps. But there's another way out. Tom Hendricks, the bush pilot whose crashed plane had started this whole ordeal, shifted uncomfortably. You didn't mention another exit before. Didn't seem necessary before. Marcus moved toward the back wall of the shelter, where Sarah had assumed solid earth lay beyond. Instead, he began removing what appeared to be camouflaged panels, revealing a narrow tunnel that disappeared into darkness. This connects to a secondary shaft about 200 yards north. The revelation sent murmurs rippling through the group. Sarah felt a chill that had nothing to do with the cold. She'd been watching Marcus carefully since they'd taken refuge in his impossible shelter, noting inconsistencies that didn't add up. The sophisticated ventilation system, the hidden food caches, the way he seemed to know exactly how much weight each support beam could bear. Just how long have you been living out here, Marcus? She asked, keeping her tone neutral despite the suspicion growing in her chest. He froze for just a moment, so briefly that most of the others probably missed it. But Sarah had spent 15 years as a state trooper reading people's tells, and that microsecond of hesitation screamed volumes. "Few years," he said, resuming his work on the panels. "You learn to prepare for the worst in country like this." Mrs. Patterson, the elderly schoolteacher from Fairbanks, wrapped her threadbare coat tighter around her shoulders. "This shelter, it's remarkable. Almost like it was designed by an engineer." Another pause. Another tell. "YouTube University," Marcus replied with forced lightness. "Amazing what you can learn online these days." But Sarah knew better. The construction techniques, the precise calculations needed for the support structure, the knowledge of underground thermal dynamics. This wasn't amateur hour. This was military-grade survival architecture, the kind of expertise that took years of specialized training to acquire. Young Emma Kozlov, barely 16 and terrified since losing contact with her parents in Anchorage, spoke up from her corner. "Are we going to die down here?" The blunt question hung in the recycled air like a physical presence. Marcus's expression softened as he looked at her, and for a moment Sarah glimpsed something genuine beneath his carefully maintained facade. "No," he said firmly, "I won't let that happen." The certainty in his voice was both reassuring and deeply troubling. Sarah had heard that tone before, in the voices of special forces operators and intelligence agents, people trained to make life-and-death decisions without hesitation. People with secrets that ran deeper than underground shelters in the Alaskan wilderness. Dr. Chen finished changing Pete's bandages and moved closer to examine the hidden tunnel. "Where does it lead exactly?" "Emergency cache," Marcus explained. "Extra supplies, communication equipment. I can make contact with the outside, let them know we're alive." "Communication equipment?" Tom's voice sharpened. "What kind of equipment?" "Satellite phone, radio gear." Marcus's answers came too quickly now, like he was reciting from a script. Standard stuff. Nothing about this was standard, and they all knew it. Sarah caught Dr. Chen's eye and saw her own suspicions reflected there. The doctor was intelligent enough to recognize that their mysterious savior wasn't telling them everything, possibly wasn't telling them anything close to the truth. But they were alive because of him. Whatever secrets Marcus harbored, whatever past he was running from or toward, he'd kept them breathing when the storm should have killed them all. The question now was whether that debt of gratitude would matter when his hidden truth finally surfaced. Because Sarah was certain it would surface. In her experience, secrets buried this deep always found their way to the light eventually. And when they did, the consequences were usually devastating for everyone involved. The tremor that shook Marcus awake wasn't from the storm. He felt it again, a deliberate vibration through the earthen walls, rhythmic and purposeful. Someone was digging. He slipped from his sleeping area, careful not to wake the others scattered throughout the shelter's main chamber. The emergency lantern cast dancing shadows as he made his way toward the sound, his bare feet silent on the packed dirt floor. The vibrations grew stronger as he approached the eastern wall. Marcus pressed his ear against the cool earth. 3 distinct impacts, pause, 2 impacts, pause, 3 impacts. The pattern repeated. His blood ran cold. It was a code, military extraction protocol. They'd found him. Can't sleep either. Marcus spun around to find Sarah approaching with her medical bag, her face drawn with exhaustion. She'd been tending to old Henrik's pneumonia through the night. "Just checking the structural integrity," Marcus said, stepping away from the wall. "The storm's been putting stress on the support beams." Sarah nodded, but her eyes lingered on his face. "You look like you've seen a ghost. How's the shoulder?" The bullet wound had been healing well under her care, but Marcus barely registered the dull ache now. "Fine. How's Henrik?" "Stable, but he needs antibiotics we don't have. His fever broke an hour ago, though." She studied Marcus more carefully. "Are you sure you're all right? You seem—" Another tremor. Stronger this time. Sarah's eyes widened as dust rained from the ceiling. What was that? Is the shelter collapsing? No, Marcus said quickly. Sometimes the frozen ground shifts. It's normal. But even as he spoke, he was calculating distances, escape routes, how many of the 19 people in the shelter he could realistically protect if armed soldiers breached the walls. Sarah didn't look convinced. Marcus, I've been thinking about some things that don't add up. Your medical knowledge, for one. You knew exactly how to treat Henrik's hypothermia, and your understanding of infection protocols is sophisticated, almost clinical. Marcus forced his expression to remain neutral. You pick things up when you live out here. And this shelter, she continued, gesturing around them. I've been examining the construction more closely. The ventilation system alone would take months to plan and build. The food storage, the waste management, the structural engineering. This isn't something you threw together. This is a long-term survival installation. The digging sounds had stopped. Marcus strained to listen, but heard only the wind howling above and the soft breathing of sleeping survivors. That silence worried him more than the digging had. Why were you really out here, Marcus? Sarah's voice was gentle but insistent. And don't tell me you were checking trap lines. Nobody runs trap lines in weather like this. Before Marcus could answer, a new sound reached them, the high whine of machinery cutting through earth. They weren't digging by hand anymore. They'd brought equipment. We need to wake everyone, Marcus said, moving toward the sleeping area. Now, wait. Sarah grabbed his arm. What's really happening? Marcus looked into her eyes and saw the intelligence there, the way she'd been piecing together inconsistencies. She was a trauma surgeon from Anchorage General. She'd said so herself. If anyone could understand the complexities of his situation, it might be her. There are people looking for me, he said finally. People I used to work with. If they find this place, everyone here is in danger. What kind of work? The cutting sound grew louder. Marcus estimated they had maybe 20 minutes before breach. The kind that leaves bodies behind, he said. Sarah, I need you to trust me. Can you do that? She searched his face for a long moment. The medical supplies you have here, military grade, and you knew exactly how to remove that bullet from your own shoulder without anesthesia. Your special forces. Pause. Past tense. Marcus moved toward the sleeping area again. Right now, I'm just someone trying to keep 19 people alive. But we need to move them. Move them where? The storm's still raging. Marcus led her toward the back of the shelter, where a narrow passage branched off from the main chamber. Emergency exit. Connects to a series of natural caves about 200 yards north. It's rough going, but it's shelter. You want to move sick people, elderly people, children through caves in sub-zero temperatures? I want to keep them alive. The cutting sound intensified. Sarah, please, help me wake them quietly. We don't have time to explain everything. She stared at him for another heartbeat, then nodded. What do I tell them? Gas leak, structural compromise, anything but the truth. As Sarah moved to wake the families with children, Marcus began rousing the others. Tom stirred first, instantly alert in the way that came from years of wilderness living. What's wrong? Tom whispered. Company's coming, Marcus said simply. The kind we don't want to meet. Tom's expression hardened. In the distance, the cutting sound grew closer. The storm's fury had finally begun to subside, leaving behind an eerie silence that somehow felt more ominous than the howling winds. Marcus stood at the shelter's entrance, watching the last wisps of snow dance in the pale morning light. 3 days had passed since they'd taken refuge in Kai's underground sanctuary, and while the immediate threat of freezing had passed, new tensions were brewing beneath the surface. Sarah emerged from the medical bay, her face drawn with exhaustion. The injured pilot, Henderson, had developed a fever during the night, and despite her efforts with their limited supplies, his condition was deteriorating. She found Kai hunched over a hand-drawn map, sketching what appeared to be a complex network of tunnels and chambers. How's he doing? Kai asked without looking up, his pencil never pausing in its precise movements. Not good. The infection is spreading faster than I can treat it with what we have here. Sarah studied the intricate diagram. What is all this? Kai's hand stilled for a moment before continuing. Emergency routes, alternative shelters, things you might need to know if... He trailed off, but the implication hung heavy in the air. If what? If you're not here to guide us? Sarah's voice carried a sharp edge. You keep talking like you're planning to disappear. Before Kai could respond, Tom's voice echoed from the main chamber, raised in frustration. This is insane. We can't just sit here indefinitely. Marcus and several others had gathered around Tom, whose face was flushed with anger and desperation. My family thinks I'm dead by now. The rescue teams will have given up searching in this weather. We need to make our own way out. Through 8 feet of snow and sub-zero temperatures? Dr. Chen shook his head. That's suicide. Maybe, but it's better than being trapped down here with someone who won't even tell us his real name. Tom's accusation cut through the group like a blade. All eyes turned to Kai, who had emerged from the side chamber with Sarah. The young man's expression remained carefully neutral, but Marcus noticed the slight tension in his shoulders, the way his eyes briefly scanned for the nearest exit. My name is Kai, he said simply. Is it though? Tom stepped closer, his voice gaining momentum. I've been thinking about this place, about you. Nobody builds something like this alone. Nobody knows this much about survival without serious training, military training. The temperature in the room seemed to drop several degrees. Marcus felt his pulse quicken as he watched Kai's reaction, or rather, the studied lack of one. You think I'm military? Kai asked, his tone carefully measured. I think you're running from something, and I think whatever you're running from might be more dangerous than the storm outside. Lisa, the teacher, spoke up from where she sat with the 2 children. Tom, he saved our lives. Without this shelter, we'd have made it to Fairbanks by now instead of getting trapped out here. Tom's frustration boiled over. Don't you find it convenient that our supposed rescuer just happened to be in exactly the right place at exactly the right time? An uncomfortable murmur rippled through the group. Marcus watched as doubt began to creep into their faces. Fear and stress had a way of twisting gratitude into suspicion, and Tom was giving voice to questions that others had been afraid to ask. Kai remained perfectly still, but Sarah stepped forward. What are you suggesting, Tom? That he somehow caused the storm, made our plane crash? I'm suggesting that maybe our Good Samaritan isn't as innocent as he appears. People don't just vanish into the Alaskan wilderness unless they have something to hide. The children huddled closer to Lisa, sensing the rising tension even if they didn't understand its source. Henderson's labored breathing from the medical bay provided a grim soundtrack to the confrontation. Marcus found himself studying Kai with new eyes. The young man's calm under pressure, his extensive knowledge, the sophisticated nature of the shelter, it did paint a picture that raised questions. But Marcus had also seen genuine concern in Kai's actions, real effort to help them survive. Even if that were true, Marcus said slowly, it doesn't change the fact that we need him right now. Henderson is getting worse. The storm might not be finished, and none of us know this terrain like he does. Exactly my point, Tom shot back. We're completely dependent on someone we know nothing about. What happens when his agenda changes, when helping us stops being convenient? Kai finally spoke, his voice quiet but carrying clearly through the chamber. You're right to be cautious. Trust shouldn't be given blindly, especially in situations like this. He paused, seeming to weigh his next words carefully. But right now your suspicions won't save Henderson's life or get you home safely. My knowledge might. The standoff stretched taut between them, 17 lives hanging in the balance of a trust that was as fragile as ice on a thawing lake. The morning brought an eerie silence that settled over the underground shelter like a heavy blanket. Sarah noticed it first when she woke to find Marcus missing from his usual spot near the radio equipment. His sleeping bag lay crumpled and empty, the fabric still holding the faint impression of his body. Has anyone seen Marcus? She called out, her voice echoing through the main chamber. Tom looked up from where he was rationing the remaining coffee supplies. Thought he was with you, working on those ventilation calculations. A knot formed in Sarah's stomach. She'd grown accustomed to Marcus's constant presence, his quiet competence that had kept them all alive. The shelter felt different without him, vulnerable somehow, despite the solid earth walls surrounding them. Elena emerged from the sleeping area, her face drawn with exhaustion. His coat's gone, and those heavy boots he found in the supply room. He wouldn't just leave, Sarah said, but even as the words left her mouth, doubt crept in. How well did any of them really know Marcus? He'd appeared like a ghost in the storm, saved their lives, and revealed precious little about himself in the process. Old Pete shuffled over, his weathered face creased with concern. Boy's been acting strange since yesterday. Kept checking that radio of his, the one he thinks we don't know about. Sarah's head snapped up. What radio? Hidden in his pack. Caught a glimpse when he thought nobody was looking. Military grade by the look of it. The pieces clicked together in Sarah's mind with sickening clarity. Marcus's extensive survival knowledge, his familiarity with military equipment, his reluctance to share personal details. And now, a secret radio. We need to search his things, she said. Tom frowned. Sarah, that's crossing a line. The man saved our lives, and I'm grateful for that. But if he's hiding something that affects our safety, we have a right to know. Elena nodded grimly. She's right. We're all in this together, or we should be. They found Marcus's pack tucked behind the water filtration system. Sarah's hands trembled as she opened it, half hoping they'd find nothing incriminating. Instead, she discovered the radio Pete had mentioned, along with a folder containing topographical maps marked with coordinates and a small notebook filled with cryptic notations. Jesus Christ, Tom breathed, looking over her shoulder at the maps. These show government installations I didn't even know existed. Sarah flipped through the notebook, her blood running cold. Page after page contained detailed observations about the community, who had leadership potential, who might resist authority, assessments of their psychological states under stress. Her own name appeared several times, along with clinical notes about her emotional volatility and potential for organized opposition. He's been studying us, Elena whispered. Like lab rats. The radio crackled to life, making them all jump. A voice emerged through the static. Eagle's Nest, this is base command. Report status, over. Sarah stared at the device, her mind racing. Eagle's Nest, was that Marcus's code name? Before anyone could stop him, old Pete grabbed the radio. Your boy Marcus ain't here right now, he growled into the device. But we found his little spy kit. Who the hell are you people? Silence stretched for several heartbeats before the voice returned, colder now. Civilians are not authorized to use this frequency. Return the device to Agent Reeves immediately. Agent Reeves. Sarah felt the bottom drop out of her world. Marcus, if that was even his real name, was a federal agent. But what kind of operation required infiltrating a stranded group of survivors? Agent Reeves is currently unavailable, Sarah said, taking the radio from Pete. This is Dr. Sarah Chen. I'm a geologist with the University of Alaska. We have a right to know what's happening here. Dr. Chen, you are interfering with a classified operation. Stand down immediately. Like hell, Sarah shot back. Marcus has been living with us, earning our trust, while secretly reporting on our every move. We deserve an explanation. The response came swift and brutal. Dr. Chen, you are currently sheltering in proximity to a compromised research facility. Agent Reeves was deployed to assess civilian exposure and containment protocols. Your cooperation is mandatory. Sarah's scientific mind latched onto the terminology. Compromised research facility, civilian exposure, containment protocols, the language of environmental disaster, or worse. What kind of research facility? She demanded. But the radio had gone silent. Tom was studying the topographical maps with growing alarm. These coordinates, he said slowly, they're marking locations all around this area. And look, He pointed to a red circle drawn around their current position. "We're right in the middle of whatever they're mapping." Elena grabbed Sarah's arm. "The shelter. Marcus knew exactly where to find it, didn't he? He led us here like he'd been planning it all along." The realization hit Sarah like a physical blow. Marcus hadn't stumbled across this shelter. He'd known about it from the beginning, which meant everything that had happened, everything she'd attributed to miraculous luck and his wilderness expertise, had been orchestrated. They weren't survivors taking refuge in an abandoned shelter. They were test subjects in someone else's carefully controlled experiment. The storm's fury had reached a crescendo that seemed to shake the very foundations of the earth above them. In the main chamber of Marcus's underground haven, 17 souls huddled around the carefully maintained fire pit, their faces illuminated by dancing flames that cast long shadows on the carved walls. The temperature outside had plummeted to -40 degrees, but here in their subterranean sanctuary it remained a steady 55. Sarah watched Marcus as he moved through the space with practiced efficiency, checking the air vents, adjusting the placement of sleeping areas, ensuring everyone had adequate water. There was something almost ritualistic about his movements, as if he'd done this countless times before. The thought sent an uncomfortable chill through her that had nothing to do with the weather. "How long have you been preparing this place?" she asked when he passed near her sleeping spot. Marcus paused, his hand resting on one of the support beams. "Long enough," he said simply, but she caught something in his voice, a weight that spoke of years, not months. Old Pete coughed violently from his corner, and Mrs. Henderson hurried over with one of their precious bottles of water. The elderly man's breathing had grown more labored throughout the day, and his skin had taken on a grayish pallor that worried everyone. Dr. Kim, the only medical professional among them, had examined him earlier with growing concern. "It's his lungs," Dr. Kim whispered to Sarah and Marcus. "The stress, the cold exposure before we got here, it's exacerbated his condition. He needs medication I don't have." Marcus nodded grimly. "There's a supply cache about 2 miles northeast of here. Medical supplies, among other things." "In this storm?" Sarah shook her head. "That's suicide. The storm will break by morning," Marcus said with certainty. "I'll go then." Sarah studied his face in the firelight. "You seem awfully sure about the weather patterns. You learn to read the signs when your life depends on it." Across the chamber, young Tommy had found Marcus's collection of books and was reading aloud to the other children. Sarah recognized the title, A Wilderness Survival Guide, and noticed how the boy pronounced even the technical terms correctly, as if he'd heard them before. Everyone seemed to be adapting to their underground life with surprising ease, following Marcus's guidance without question. But questions were exactly what Sarah had. She waited until Marcus stepped into one of the smaller chambers, what he called the storage room, and followed him. The space was larger than she'd initially thought, carved deep into the permafrost with the same precise technique as the rest of the shelter. Shelves lined the walls, stocked with enough supplies to last months, not weeks. "This isn't a recent project," she said, running her hand along the smooth wall. "This took years to build." Marcus continued organizing supplies, his back to her. "Time moves differently up here. You work when you can." "Stop." Her voice carried the authority she'd developed during her years as a social worker, dealing with evasive teenagers and defensive parents. "I've spent my career learning when someone isn't telling the truth. This place, your knowledge, the way you knew exactly where to find us in the storm, none of it adds up to someone who just moved here recently." Marcus finally turned to face her. In the dim light of the single lantern, his young features seemed older somehow, carved with experiences that didn't match his apparent age. "Some questions are better left unasked, Sarah. Not when 17 lives are depending on answers." She stepped closer. "Who are you really? And why do I get the feeling you've done this before?" Before Marcus could respond, Dr. Kim appeared in the doorway. "You need to come quickly. It's Pete. He's not responding." They rushed back to the main chamber to find the elderly man unconscious, his breathing shallow and irregular. The other survivors had gathered around, their faces tight with fear and helplessness. Dr. Kim knelt beside Pete, checking his pulse, His heart rate is erratic, without proper medication, without oxygen. She didn't need to finish the sentence. Marcus stood perfectly still for a moment, then moved to a section of the wall Sarah hadn't noticed before. He pressed against what looked like solid stone, and a hidden panel slid aside, revealing another cache of supplies. From it, he pulled a small medical kit and handed it to Dr. Kim. Her eyes widened as she opened it. Inside were medications that shouldn't have existed in a wilderness shelter, advanced cardiac drugs, oxygen canisters, equipment that belonged in a hospital emergency room. "This will help," she said, immediately beginning to administer treatment. "But how did you—" Later, Marcus cut her off, glancing meaningfully at the frightened faces around them. As Dr. Kim worked to stabilize Pete, Sarah caught Marcus's arm. "We're going to finish this conversation," she whispered. Marcus nodded slowly, resignation settling over his features like a mask. "I know. But Sarah, when we do, you might wish we hadn't." Above them, the wind howled with renewed fury, as if the storm itself was trying to keep their secrets buried beneath the frozen ground. The silence in the shelter felt different now, heavier, charged with unspoken accusations. Sarah watched as Marcus methodically checked the ventilation system, his movements precise despite the tension radiating from his shoulders. 3 days had passed since Tom's death, and the fragile trust that had held their group together was fracturing like ice under spring thaw. "We need to talk about rationing," Ellen announced, her voice cutting through the quiet. She stood near the food storage area, clipboard in hand, every inch the school administrator, even in their underground refuge. "At current consumption rates, we have maybe 10 days left." 12, Marcus corrected without looking up from the air intake valve he was adjusting. 14, if we cut portions by 20%. "How can you be so precise?" Dr. Patterson asked, suspicion creeping into his tone. "Unless you've been planning for exactly this scenario." Marcus's hands stilled on the equipment. Sarah felt her pulse quicken. She'd been dreading this moment, when the others would start asking the questions that had been gnawing at her since the first night. "I calculate everything," Marcus said carefully. "It's how I stay alive up here." "Alone," Ellen emphasized. "A 20-something kid surviving solo in conditions that would kill experienced outdoorsmen, using techniques that seem almost—" She paused, searching for the right word. "Military," Dr. Patterson finished. The temperature in the shelter seemed to drop several degrees. Sarah glanced around at the faces surrounding them, weathered locals who'd spent their entire lives fighting Alaska's harsh realities, now looking at their savior with growing wariness. "Where exactly did you learn to build something like this?" Jim Kowalski spoke up, gesturing at the sophisticated shelter around them. The grizzled mechanic had been quiet since Tom's death, but Sarah could see the doubt building in his eyes. Marcus finally turned to face them, his expression unreadable. "Trial and error. Books. Internet when I had access. Bullshit." The word came from Beth, surprising everyone. The normally soft-spoken woman stepped forward, her face flushed with emotion. "My husband was Special Forces. I know military construction when I see it. This place wasn't built by some hermit kid reading survival manuals." Sarah's stomach clenched as she watched Marcus's carefully constructed facade begin to crumble. She thought about the precise way he moved, the instant threat assessment that flickered across his features whenever someone approached too quickly, the nightmares that woke him gasping in languages she couldn't identify. "Does it matter?" Marcus asked quietly. "You're alive because of this shelter." "It matters if you're lying to us," Dr. Patterson said, stepping closer. "It matters if there's something you're not telling us about why you're really here, hiding in the middle of nowhere." The accusation hung in the air like smoke from a dying fire. Sarah watched as something shifted in Marcus's posture, a subtle straightening, a withdrawal that seemed to happen on multiple levels simultaneously. "I'm not hiding," he said, but even Sarah could hear how unconvincing it sounded. "Then prove it," Ellen challenged. "Tell us who you really are. Tell us how a kid your age knows things that most people would need years of specialized training to learn." Marcus was quiet for so long that Sarah began to wonder if he would answer at all. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a weight that made her shiver. "Some knowledge comes at a price you wouldn't want to pay." "What's that supposed to mean?" Jim demanded. Before Marcus could respond, a low rumble echoed through the shelter, different from the usual wind patterns they'd grown accustomed to. Everyone froze, listening intently as the sound grew louder, more distinct. "Engines," Dr. Patterson whispered. Marcus moved faster than Sarah had ever seen him move, practically diving toward one of his equipment panels. His fingers flew over controls she didn't recognize, and suddenly screens flickered to life, showing exterior views she hadn't known existed. "How many cameras do you have out there?" Beth asked, her voice tight with suspicion. Marcus didn't answer, his attention fixed on the displays. Sarah could see vehicles, snowmobiles, and what looked like a modified truck, cutting through the storm toward their location. "Who is that?" Ellen demanded. "How could anyone else know we're here?" Sarah watched Marcus's face go pale as he studied the approaching figures. There was something in his expression she'd never seen before. Not fear exactly, but a kind of resigned dread that made her blood run cold. "Marcus," she said softly, "who are those people?" He turned to look at her, and in his eyes she saw an apology that chilled her more than any blizzard ever could. "The kind of people who don't leave loose ends," he said quietly. "The kind who trained me to build places like this." He paused, his gaze sweeping across their faces. "And the kind who will kill every one of you to get to me." The crackling fire cast dancing shadows across the shelter's walls as Marcus worked frantically over his makeshift radio equipment. 3 days had passed since the avalanche, and the community had settled into an uneasy routine within the underground warren he'd constructed. But something was wrong, terribly wrong, and only he knew it. Sarah approached with a steaming cup of pine needle tea, her footsteps soft on the packed earth floor. "Any luck reaching the outside?" Marcus didn't look up from the tangle of wires and salvaged components. His hands trembled slightly as he adjusted a frequency dial. Static, nothing but static. She set the cup beside him and noticed the sweat beading on his forehead despite the cool temperature. "You've been at this for hours. Maybe you should rest." "Can't rest." The words came out sharper than he intended. "We need to warn them." "Warn who? About what?" Marcus finally met her eyes, and Sarah saw something that chilled her more than the Alaskan wind ever could. Pure, undiluted fear. Not the manageable concern of a man worried about survival, but the terror of someone who knew a secret too terrible to bear alone. Before he could answer, Tom Henderson's voice echoed from the main chamber. "Marcus, you need to see this." They rushed through the narrow corridor to find Tom standing beside the shelter's reinforced entrance, holding a chunk of ice in his gloved hands. The ice glowed with an eerie blue-green phosphorescence, pulsing like a slow heartbeat. "Found it near the air vent," Tom said, his voice hushed. "Never seen anything like it." Marcus stared at the glowing ice, his face draining of color. He snatched it from Tom's hands, ignoring the man's startled protest, and threw it into the fire. The flames hissed and turned an unnatural shade of violet before returning to their normal orange glow. "Don't touch anything like that again," Marcus said, his voice deadly serious. "And don't let anyone else touch it either." "What the hell was that?" Tom demanded. The shelter fell silent except for the crackling fire and the whisper of wind through the ventilation system. Every face turned toward Marcus, waiting for an explanation he couldn't give, not without revealing everything. Dr. Elena Vasquez pushed through the crowd, her medical training evident in her purposeful stride. "Marcus, I need to examine some of the others. 3 people are showing symptoms I can't explain." "What kind of symptoms?" "Fever, but their skin is cold to the touch, fatigue that sleep doesn't cure, and—" she hesitated. "Their eyes are changing color, becoming lighter, almost translucent." Marcus closed his eyes and whispered something that might have been a prayer or a curse. When he opened them again, his expression had hardened into resolve. "How long do we have?" Elena asked quietly, recognizing the look of a man who knew more than he was saying. If I'm right, maybe a week. Less if the contamination spreads faster than I calculated. Contamination? Sarah's voice rose. What contamination? Marcus, what aren't you telling us? He looked around the chamber at the faces of the 37 people who had trusted him with their lives. Families huddled together for warmth, children sleeping peacefully in their parents' arms, all of them depending on him, believing he was their salvation. The truth burned in his throat like acid. The storm wasn't natural, he said finally. And this place, this shelter I built, it wasn't meant for rescue. It was meant for containment. The silence that followed was deafening. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. Tom stepped forward, his face flushed with anger. What do you mean, containment? I used to work for a government research facility, Project Aurora. We were studying atmospheric manipulation, weather control. But something went wrong during our last test. The energy release created a feedback loop. It's been growing, spreading, changing everything it touches. The blizzard, Elena breathed. Marcus nodded. The storm is feeding on itself, becoming stronger, and it's not just changing the weather, it's altering organic matter at the cellular level. The ice Tom found, that's the early stage. Anyone exposed for too long will... He couldn't finish the sentence. Sarah grabbed his arm. Will what, Marcus? They'll become part of it. The storm needs hosts to continue growing. Human hosts. Panic rippled through the group. Parents pulled their children closer. Some moved toward the entrance, others backed away from it. The careful calm that had sustained them shattered like glass. So you knew, Tom said, his voice cold. You built this shelter knowing we were contaminated, knowing we might all die anyway. I built it hoping I could find a way to reverse the process, Marcus shot back. The equipment, the radio, I've been trying to contact the research facility. They might have developed a cure by now. Might have? Marcus stared into the fire, watching the flames dance. Outside, the wind howled with renewed fury, and somewhere in its voice he could swear he heard the storm calling his name. We're about to find out. The generator's mechanical whine cut through the underground silence like a death knell. Sarah felt her stomach drop as the lights flickered once, twice, then died completely. Emergency lanterns cast eerie shadows across the shelter's main chamber, where 23 survivors huddled in the sudden darkness. Marcus, Dr. Chen's voice carried a tremor she'd never heard before. How long do we have? Marcus emerged from the generator alcove, his face grim in the lantern light. The fuel line's completely frozen. Even if I can thaw it, we've got maybe 6 hours of power left. He wiped grease-stained hands on his jacket. The backup batteries won't last through the night. Without heat, the shelter would become a tomb within hours. Sarah could already feel the cold seeping through the walls, hungry and patient. Around her, people pulled blankets tighter, their breath beginning to form small clouds in the cooling air. There has to be something, Elena whispered, clutching her daughter close. Some other fuel source, another generator. Marcus shook his head. I've checked everything twice. The storm damaged more than just the main line. The whole system's compromised. Sarah noticed Kai hadn't spoken. He sat apart from the group, staring at the dead generator with an expression she couldn't read. Something flickered in his eyes, a knowledge he was holding back. Kai? She moved toward him. Do you have any ideas? For a long moment, he said nothing. The silence stretched until it became uncomfortable, broken only by the wind howling somewhere far above their heads. When he finally looked up, his face was pale. There's something I haven't told you. His voice was barely audible. About this place. About why I knew exactly where to dig. The shelter fell completely silent. Even the children sensed the gravity in his tone. This isn't just a shelter I built, Kai continued, his words coming slowly, as if each one caused him physical pain. It's a bunker, military, built in 1962 during the Cold War as part of a classified early warning system. Sarah felt the blood drain from her face. How do you know that? Because I've been here before. Kai stood, his movements mechanical. My grandfather was stationed here. He told me stories when I was a kid. about the hidden entrance, the layout, the emergency protocols. He paused, swallowing hard. He also told me about the fail-safe. Dr. Chen leaned forward. What kind of fail-safe? There's an auxiliary power source, a small nuclear reactor designed to keep the communications equipment running for months if necessary. Kai's hands were shaking now. It's still here, still functional. The implications hit Sarah like a physical blow. Nuclear? You're talking about radiation exposure. The containment is intact, Kai said quickly. I checked it when I first found this place 2 years ago, but activating it... He trailed off, staring at his hands. There are risks, significant ones. Marcus stepped closer, his engineer's mind already working. What kind of risks? The activation process requires manual override. Someone has to go into the reactor chamber, disable the safety locks, and bring the system online. Kai met his eyes. The radiation exposure during startup would be massive, potentially lethal. Elena's sharp intake of breath echoed through the chamber. You're talking about a suicide mission. Maybe not, Kai said, but his voice lacked conviction. The exposure might not be immediately fatal. With proper precautions, someone could survive long enough to die slowly instead of quickly. Dr. Chen's medical training had kicked in, her voice clinical and harsh. What you're describing is acute radiation syndrome. Even if someone survived the initial exposure, they'd face organ failure, immune system collapse, internal bleeding. Sarah's mind raced through the horrible mathematics. 23 people would live, but only at the cost of one person's agonizing death. The ethical weight of it was crushing. There has to be another way, she said desperately. Some other option we haven't considered. But even as she spoke, she could feel the temperature dropping. The youngest children were already showing signs of hypothermia, lethargy, confusion, uncontrollable shivering. Without heat, they'd start losing people within hours anyway. I'll do it, Kai said quietly. It's my responsibility. I brought you all here, and I'm the only one who knows the activation sequence. No. Marcus stepped forward. I'm the oldest here. I've lived my life. That's not how this works, Elena snapped, surprising everyone with her vehemence. We don't just sacrifice people because it's convenient. But Sarah could see it in their faces, the terrible calculus of survival. 1 life against 23, the cold, brutal logic that reduced human existence to numbers on a ledger. How long do we have to decide? She asked. Kai checked his watch. The reactor needs at least 4 hours to reach full power output. If we wait much longer... He gestured at the children, who were growing more listless by the minute. The decision was being made for them, Sarah realized. Time itself had become their enemy, more implacable than the storm raging overhead. The flickering light of the emergency lantern cast dancing shadows across Maya's face as she pressed her ear against the wooden door separating the main shelter from Kai's private quarters. The muffled sounds of his voice carried through the barrier, speaking in what sounded like rapid, urgent phrases in a language she couldn't identify. Her heart hammered against her ribs. 3 days had passed since Dr. Patterson's revelation about the military search protocols, and Kai had grown increasingly withdrawn. He disappeared into his quarters for hours at a time, emerging only to check on the shelter's systems or distribute their dwindling food supplies. When anyone tried to engage him in conversation, his responses were clipped, distant. Maya. The whispered voice behind her made her jump. She spun around to find Tom standing in the shadows, his weathered face creased with concern. What are you doing? Listening, she whispered back, gesturing toward the door. He's been in there for 3 hours. I think he's talking to someone. Tom's eyebrows shot up. How? The radio's been dead since the storm hit. Before Maya could respond, the door creaked open. Kai emerged, his face pale and drawn. He stopped short when he saw them standing there, his dark eyes darting between their faces. Is everything all right? Maya asked, trying to keep her voice casual. Kai's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. Fine, just reviewing some technical manuals. He moved past them toward the main chamber, but Maya caught his arm. Kai, wait. We need to talk. All of us. He turned back, and she saw something she'd never seen in his eyes before. Fear, not the healthy respect for nature's dangers that had kept them all alive, but raw, desperate terror. "There's nothing to discuss," he said quietly. "The storm should break within the next day or two. Then you can all leave." "That's just it," Tom interjected, stepping closer. "We've been thinking, when rescue comes, when people ask questions about how we survived, you tell them about the shelter." Kai cut him off. "You tell them I knew the area. Nothing more." Maya shook her head. "It won't be that simple. The authorities will want to interview you, document everything. They'll want to know how a 20-something guy built something like this, how you knew about the storm patterns, the geological surveys." I said nothing more. Kai's voice carried a sharp edge that made both of them step back. The tension was broken by Anna's voice calling from the main chamber. "Maya, Tom, you need to see this." They found Anna and the others gathered around Dr. Patterson, who was holding what looked like a small electronic device. The scientist's hands were shaking as he stared at its screen. "What is it?" Maya asked. "Emergency beacon," Patterson said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Military grade. I found it hidden in my pack. Someone must have slipped it in before the storm hit." Sarah leaned forward, squinting at the device. "Is it working?" Patterson nodded slowly. "It's been transmitting our location for the past 6 hours. According to this, there's a response team approximately 40 miles out, moving in our direction." The shelter fell silent except for the soft hum of the ventilation system. Maya felt the weight of the revelation settle over the group like a heavy blanket. Rescue was coming, but judging by Kai's expression, that wasn't necessarily good news. "How long do we have?" David asked. "Based on their current rate of movement through the snow, maybe 8 to 10 hours, Patterson replied. Maya turned to look for Kai, but he had vanished. She heard the sound of his door closing with a soft click that somehow felt final. "We need to decide what we're going to tell them," Tom said quietly. "About Kai, about this place." "We tell them the truth," Anna said firmly, "that he saved our lives." "But what if the truth puts him in danger?" Sarah asked. "There's obviously something he's not telling us, something he's afraid of." Dr. Patterson set down the beacon and rubbed his temples. "I've been thinking about those geological surveys he mentioned, the way he knew exactly where the storm would hit. That kind of predictive capability, combined with this level of engineering, it suggests access to resources and intelligence that shouldn't be available to a civilian." "You think he's military?" David asked. "Or former military. Possibly someone who went dark, took classified information with him." Maya felt a chill that had nothing to do with the weather outside. The pieces were starting to form a picture she didn't like. Kai's youth, his extraordinary skills, his obvious terror at the prospect of official scrutiny, it all pointed to someone running from something serious. 8 hours, she murmured, staring at the beacon's blinking light. "We have 8 hours to figure out how to protect the person who saved all our lives." Outside, the wind continued its relentless howling, but for the first time since they'd taken shelter, Maya found herself hoping the storm wouldn't end. The storm's fury had finally broken, leaving behind an eerie silence that pressed against Maya's eardrums as she emerged from the underground shelter. 3 days of howling winds and driving snow had transformed the landscape into something alien, rolling white dunes where familiar landmarks once stood, twisted metal sculptures that had been vehicles, and an otherworldly stillness that made her question if they were the last people alive on Earth. Generators running low, Tom's voice cracked behind her, exhaustion evident in every syllable. "Maybe 6 hours left, if we're lucky." Maya nodded without turning around, her breath forming crystalline clouds in the bitter air. The shelter that had saved them all was now becoming their tomb. 23 people crammed into a space designed for half that number, the air growing thicker with each passing hour despite Kai's ingenious ventilation system. Speaking of Kai, he hadn't spoken since yesterday morning. Since the radio transmission. The memory sent ice through her veins that had nothing to do with the sub-zero temperature. That crackling voice cutting through the static speaking in rapid Russian, and Kai's face draining of all color as he lunged for the radio to silence it. But it was too late. Several people had heard enough to recognize the accent, the urgency, the way the voice had said Kai's name, or rather, another name entirely. Alexei Volkov, respond immediately. Your position has been compromised. Maya's military training had taught her to read situations quickly, and everything about that moment screamed danger. The way Kai's hands had trembled as he switched off the radio, the forced calm in his voice when he'd claimed it was just interference from a foreign station, the fact that he'd positioned himself near the emergency exit ever since. Now, as she stood in the devastating aftermath of the blizzard, Maya realized they faced two threats: the merciless wilderness that could kill them through cold and starvation, and whatever truth Kai had been hiding that might be far worse. A sound made her turn, footsteps crunching through the snow. Kai emerged from the shelter's entrance, his young face gaunt but alert, those sharp blue eyes scanning the horizon with practiced efficiency. He moved differently now that his secret was partially exposed, like a wild animal calculating escape routes. The South Pass might be clear enough, he said, his accent seeming more pronounced now that Maya was listening for it. If we leave within the hour, we could reach the ranger station by nightfall. All of us? Maya asked quietly, including the elderly, the injured? Something flickered across his features. Genuine pain, she thought. For a moment, he looked like the frightened young man who had first offered them shelter. Then the mask slipped back into place. We don't have a choice. The generator. I know about the generator. Maya stepped closer, lowering her voice. What I don't know is why someone is looking for you badly enough to risk radio communication during a security blackout, or why your shelter is stocked with enough supplies for a small army, or why you have scars from torture on your wrists. Kai's jaw tightened, but he didn't deny it. Behind them, more voices emerged from the shelter as people began to wake and assess their situation. Maya could hear Bill coughing, a harsh sound that had worsened overnight, and Sarah trying to comfort her frightened children. If I tell you, Kai whispered, you'll wish I hadn't. Try me. He stared at her for a long moment, and Maya saw a war playing out behind his eyes. Finally, his shoulders sagged slightly in defeat. My real name is Alexei Volkov. 2 years ago, I stole classified information from a Russian military installation and defected to the United States. The CIA relocated me here, thought the wilderness would be the perfect place to disappear. His laugh was bitter. They were wrong. What kind of information? The location of weapons caches hidden throughout Alaska, sleeper cells, plans for infrastructure attacks. His voice dropped to barely a whisper. Enough to cripple your entire northwestern defense grid. Maya felt the blood drain from her face. And now they've found you. The storm provided perfect cover for them to move assets into position. They're probably already here, waiting. He glanced toward the tree line, where shadows could hide an army. That transmission yesterday wasn't just checking on me, it was confirming coordinates for an extraction team, or an elimination team, Maya said grimly. Kai nodded. Everyone in that shelter is now a liability. They'll kill them all to tie up loose ends. The weight of it crashed down on her. 23 innocent people who had survived nature's worst assault, only to face something far more deadly. People who trusted the young man who had saved their lives, not knowing he might have also doomed them. From the shelter came the sound of children laughing, probably playing some game to pass the time. The sound seemed obscene in light of what Maya now knew. How long do we have? She asked. Kai's eyes met hers, and she saw her own death reflected there. They're already here. The radio crackled to life at dawn, piercing through the tension that had settled over the underground shelter like a suffocating blanket. Marcus lunged for it, his hands trembling as he adjusted the frequency. This is Alaska State Rescue calling any survivors in the Denali Creek region. Please respond. Sarah grabbed his shoulder, her eyes wide with hope and desperation. Around them, the remaining survivors pressed closer, their faces gaunt from weeks of rationing and fear. Elena clutched her sleeping daughter tighter, while Dr. Harrison struggled to sit up from his makeshift bed, his fever finally breaking. "This is Marcus Chen in the underground shelter," he spoke into the radio, his voice hoarse. "We have 8 survivors, including 2 children. Medical attention urgently needed." The response came immediately. "Copy that. We've been searching for you. Weather's clearing enough for a helicopter drop. Can you provide coordinates?" Marcus rattled off the GPS coordinates he'd memorized, then added, "Be advised, we have limited surface access. The main entrance is buried under 12 feet of snow." "Understood. ETA, 40 minutes. Stay put and mark your location if possible." As the radio fell silent, a collective exhale filled the chamber. But Kai remained motionless in the corner, his face a mask of resignation. Sarah noticed his stillness and approached him slowly. "We're getting out," she said softly. "It's over." Kai looked up at her, his eyes reflecting a pain that went deeper than their weeks of survival. "For you, maybe." The sound of rotor blades reached them 37 minutes later, a mechanical thunder that grew louder until it seemed to shake the very earth above their heads. The survivors cheered, some crying with relief, but Kai stood and moved toward the back tunnel without a word. "Where are you going?" Sarah called after him. "There's another way out," he said simply, "through the caverns. They connect to the old mining shafts about 2 miles north." Marcus stepped forward, confusion creasing his brow. "You never mentioned those before." "Because I hoped I'd never need them." Kai shouldered his pack, already loaded with supplies. "The rescue team will ask questions. They'll want to know how I built all this, where I learned to survive like this. And when they start digging into my background—" "You're running," Sarah said, the realization hitting her like a physical blow. "I'm protecting all of you." Kai's voice was steady, but his hands shook slightly as he checked his gear. "Whatever happens when they investigate me, it won't touch any of you. You were just lucky enough to find shelter." Above them, voices called out, and the sound of digging began. The rescue team was working to clear the entrance. They had minutes, maybe less. Elena stepped forward, still holding her daughter. "You saved our lives. Whatever you're running from doesn't matter now." Kai cut her off gently. "What matters is that you all get home safe." Dr. Harrison struggled to his feet, leaning heavily on James for support. "Son, we don't even know your real name." Kai paused at the tunnel entrance, his silhouette already half swallowed by shadows. "It's better that way." Sarah moved toward him, desperation in her eyes. "This is insane. You can't just disappear into the wilderness. The storm might be clearing, but it's still dangerous out there." "I've been dangerous my whole life," Kai replied. "The wilderness is the one place that makes sense to me." The digging sounds grew louder, voices more distinct. Someone called down through the snow. "Hello, can anyone hear us?" Marcus cupped his hands and shouted back, "We're here, 8 survivors!" When he turned around, the tunnel entrance was empty. Kai had vanished like smoke, leaving behind only the shelter that had saved their lives and questions that would haunt them forever. "We don't mention him," Sarah said suddenly, her voice fierce and protective. "Not until we decide what's right." The others nodded, an unspoken pact forming between them. They would be survivors who found an abandoned shelter, nothing more. They owed Kai that much. Light began filtering down from above as the rescue team broke through. Ropes dropped into the chamber, followed by emergency medical personnel in bright orange gear. The survivors were quickly assessed, given emergency rations and medical attention, then prepared for extraction. As Sarah was lifted toward the surface, she caught one last glimpse of the tunnel where Kai had disappeared. Somewhere in those dark passages, he was making his way through miles of underground caverns toward an uncertain future, carrying whatever secrets had made him into their unlikely savior. The sunlight hit her face like a benediction as she emerged from their underground tomb, but part of her remained in those tunnels, wondering if they would ever see their mysterious guardian again, and whether the world above was ready for the truth about what had really saved them in the depths of the Alaskan winter. The silence that followed Marcus's revelation stretched like a taut wire across the underground chamber. Elena felt the weight of 47 pairs of eyes, shifting between her and the man who had saved them all, the man whose very presence might now doom them. How long? Dr. Harrison's voice cut through the stillness, clinical and precise. How long before they find us? Marcus sat hunched against the earthen wall, his face pale in the flickering lamplight. The storm bought us time. Maybe a week, maybe less. Depends on how many resources they're willing to commit. He looked up, meeting Elena's gaze. I never meant for any of you to get caught in this. Caught in what, exactly? Elena kept her voice steady, though her heart hammered against her ribs. What did you take from them? A bitter laugh escaped Marcus's lips. Take? I didn't take anything. I am what they're after. He pulled back his sleeve, revealing a series of small, precise scars along his forearm. Project Winterborn, experimental hypothermia resistance trials, genetic modification, enhanced survival capabilities. His voice dropped to a whisper. I was their prize specimen until I escaped. Old Pete spat into the fire, making it hiss. Figures. Government always messing with things they shouldn't. Not government, Marcus said. Private military contractors. Blackwater types, but worse. They've been developing enhanced soldiers for Arctic warfare. Super soldiers who can survive in conditions that would kill normal people in minutes. He gestured around the shelter. How do you think I built all this? How did I know exactly where to dig, what materials to use, how to keep 47 people alive in a space that should barely hold 20? Elena felt the pieces clicking into place, the uncanny efficiency of the shelter design, Marcus's preternatural calm during the worst moments of the storm, the way he seemed to know things about survival that went beyond mere experience. The modifications, Dr. Harrison said, his medical training overriding his fear. What exactly did they do to you? Enhanced metabolic regulation, improved circulation, modified brown fat distribution, increased pain tolerance. Marcus touched the scars again, and a few other things they haven't perfected yet. I was their most successful test subject, which is why I'm so valuable to them. Sarah Chen had been quiet until now, but she stepped forward, her expression fierce. So we fight them. We have the advantage of numbers. Against military contractors with Arctic warfare training and unlimited resources? Marcus shook his head. These aren't mall security guards, Sarah. These people will kill every one of you to get to me, and they'll sleep fine afterward. The weight of their situation settled over the group like a suffocating blanket. Children pressed closer to their parents. The elderly looked suddenly frailer. Elena could see the fear spreading from person to person like a virus. There's another way, Marcus said quietly. I leave, tonight. Draw them away from here. In this storm? Elena stepped toward him. That's suicide. Not for me. That's the point. I can survive out there in conditions that would kill anyone else. I make enough noise heading in the opposite direction. They'll follow my trail instead of looking for this shelter. And then what? You spend the rest of your life running? Marcus met her eyes, and she saw something there she hadn't noticed before. A deep, bone-deep exhaustion that had nothing to do with physical fatigue. I've been running for 3 years. What's the rest of my life? No. The word came out of Elena's mouth before she fully realized she'd spoken. We stick together, all of us. That's what we've done this whole time, and it's what's kept us alive. Elena's right, Dr. Harrison said. We're stronger as a group. And you, whatever they did to you, you're still human. You still deserve protection. A murmur of agreement rippled through the shelter. Tom Bradley, who'd initially been suspicious of Marcus, stepped forward. The boy saved our lives. Least we can do is try to save his. Marcus looked around the chamber, his expression caught between hope and disbelief. You don't understand what you're up against. Maybe not, Elena said. But we've survived this long because we worked together. We trusted each other. That doesn't change now. Old Pete coughed, then spoke in his gravelly voice. Been in Alaska 70 years. Seen plenty of folks who thought they could take whatever they wanted from this land. Most of them learned different, one way or another. Elena felt a spark of something. Not quite hope, but determination. We have advantages they don't. We know this shelter better than anyone. We know how to work together. And we have something worth fighting for." She looked around at the faces surrounding her, young and old, frightened but resolute. These people had already survived the impossible. Maybe, just maybe, they could do it again. Outside, the wind continued its relentless howl, but Elena no longer heard just the voice of the storm. She heard the sound of time running out. The morning sun cast long shadows across the snow-covered clearing as Maya stood beside the radio equipment, her breath forming white clouds in the frigid air. Static crackled through the speaker before giving way to the clear voice of the rescue coordinator. "Understood, base camp. Weather window looks good for the next 6 hours. We're moving in now." She turned to find Ethan emerging from the main shelter entrance, his face pale but determined. The community had voted the night before, a difficult decision that split them down the middle until Sarah Chen's impassioned speech about trust and redemption tipped the scales. They would tell the rescue teams everything, including Ethan's past, but they would also speak for him. "The helicopters will be here within the hour," Maya said, studying his expression. "You sure about this?" Ethan nodded, though his hands trembled slightly. "I've been running from this for 3 years. Time to face it." Around them, the survivors moved with purpose, gathering their few possessions and helping the injured prepare for transport. Dr. Martinez had stabilized everyone overnight, but several people still needed immediate medical attention once they reached Fairbanks. Tom Brennan approached, his weathered face serious. "Son, I've been thinking about what you told us, about the lab, the research." He paused, glancing around at the elaborate shelter system that had saved them all. "Whatever mistakes you made before, you saved 17 lives here. That counts for something. Tell that to the families of the people who died because of what I helped create," Ethan replied quietly. "Maybe you will," Tom said. "Maybe that's part of making this right." The distant thrum of helicopter rotors began to echo across the valley, growing steadily louder. Maya felt her stomach tighten. In a few hours this would all be over, but she couldn't shake the feeling that for Ethan it was just beginning. The first helicopter appeared over the tree line, followed by 2 others. They circled the clearing once before setting down in a coordinated landing that sent snow swirling in all directions. Rescue personnel poured out, moving with practiced efficiency. Maya Santos, the team leader, a tall woman in an orange rescue suit, approached with a clipboard. "I'm Commander Walsh. We've got medical transport standing by and debriefing teams waiting in Fairbanks." "There's something you need to know before we leave," Maya said, glancing toward Ethan. "About how we survived, and about one of our group." Commander Walsh followed her gaze. "The young man who built the shelters? We've been studying the thermal signatures from satellite images. Remarkable engineering. We'll want to debrief him thoroughly." "It's more complicated than that." Maya took a breath. "His name is Ethan Cross. He's wanted by federal authorities in connection with a bioweapons incident 3 years ago." The commander's expression shifted immediately, her hand moving to her radio. "Are you certain?" "He told us himself. Turned himself in, basically." Maya stepped closer, lowering her voice. "But he also saved our lives. Without his shelters and survival knowledge, we'd all be dead." Commander Walsh spoke quietly into her radio, then looked back at Maya. "Federal agents are being contacted now. He'll be taken into custody once we reach Fairbanks." Maya watched as the rescue teams helped load the injured into the medical helicopter. Ethan worked alongside them, using his knowledge of the shelter's layout to help extract equipment and supplies. Even now, facing arrest and possible imprisonment, he was still trying to help. Sarah Chen appeared at Maya's side, supporting her bandaged arm. "Think he'll be okay?" "I don't know," Maya admitted. "But we'll testify for him, all of us. That has to count for something." The loading process took nearly 2 hours. Ethan was among the last to board, and Maya noticed Commander Walsh speaking quietly with her team as he approached the helicopter. They would be ready for him. As the aircraft lifted off, Maya pressed her face to the small window, watching the shelter complex shrink below them. The ingenious network of tunnels and chambers that had preserved their lives would soon be studied by experts, photographed and documented. But she doubted anyone would truly understand the desperation and hope that had driven its creation. Beside her, Ethan stared out at the endless wilderness, his expression unreadable. "Thank you," he said quietly, "for trusting me, for giving me a chance to do something right." "Thank you for keeping us alive," Maya replied. The helicopter banked toward Fairbanks, carrying them back to a world that felt strange and distant after their weeks in isolation. Maya knew the real challenges were just beginning. The investigations, the media attention, the long process of rebuilding their lives. But they were alive. Against all odds, in the face of nature's fury and human fallibility, they had survived. And perhaps, Maya thought, as she watched Ethan's quiet resolve, they had all learned something about redemption in the process. The wilderness fell away beneath them, white and endless and unforgiving, but no longer insurmountable.